Greetings from Stanford University. I'm Bill Barnett, professor at the Stanford Doerr School of Sustainability and the Stanford Graduate School of Business.
I'm Ingrid Ackermann, an undergraduate in the School of Engineering.
And we have with us here today Nicole Ardoin and James Holland Jones, both from the Stanford Doerr School of Sustainability, both of you in our budding Environmental Behavioral Sciences Department. We just ran a conference on adaptation and innovation for sustainable societies. And Nicole, Jamie, you guys put together a heck of a conference. And Ingrid, you were there. What's your reaction?
I really enjoyed seeing the social side of sustainability and climate change. It's something that I haven't really explored before.
I see. And so Nicole, why don't we start off with your reactions?
I thoroughly enjoyed it. So Jamie and I were delighted to be invited to organize this conference. The overall theme initially was on environmental behavior, since, as you said, Jamie and I are in the environmental behavioral sciences group. And that is such a huge topic. So we realized that within that topic, we needed to narrow it a bit more. And since we're really interested in this notion of adaptation, which of course came up at the conference, it's a bit of a fraught term and topic. And so we thought it would be fun to play around with how we might reframe it and reclaim it. So we thought about how we might narrow it a bit. So that's how we came to adaptation and innovation. I know Jamie was actually the one who coined that. So Jamie, would you like to talk a bit about that more?
I mean, I've been studying adaptation my whole career in one form or another. And I've recently shifted my attention in the domain of adaptation towards climate change adaptation and sustainability. So it seemed a natural thing for us to do.
For a bit more context, do you mind explaining environmental behavior and then also adaptation?
So I should note that I am an evolutionary anthropologist. Depending on what crowd I'm in, I'm either perceived as a social scientist or a biological scientist. Usually when I'm with like physical scientists, I'm seen as a social scientist. And when I'm with social scientists, I'm seen as a biological scientist. Kind of an anti-Zelig in that way. So I take a very strongly biological take on adaptation. Adaptation is the improvement of an organism or a collective's outcome as a function of changing environments, right? So you get better through selective processes in the environment. And this seems actually like a reasonable way to think about adaptation in the climate change case as well, though I don't think that most people think of it that way.
Oh, interesting. Interesting. How do you think most people think of it?
Well, there's a very negative connotation. There's this real sort of pessimistic valence associated with adaptation. Al Gore is famously anti-adaptation. There was a paper in Nature in 2007 about rehabilitating adaptation, and it's seen in a sort of like framed in terms of something like Paulo Freire would say. It's coping. Adapted man is coping. He's not enlightened. He's not free, right? And that's very much not the way that that anthropologists in general, particularly evolutionary anthropologists, biologists, think about adaptation. They think about adaptation as improving our lot, right?
Sure.
And I think that there's a little bit of a status quo bias in this idea that somehow adaptation is a negative, right? We're settling for second best.
Interesting.
Whereas the innovation comes in by thinking about, how can we actually improve our welfare beyond what it is now, right? And in sort of standard climate discourse, that'll often, they'll draw a contrast between adaptation and mitigation. But in the way that I and a lot of my colleagues think, adaptation is really a superset that includes mitigation and innovation and these sorts of things.
So if we innovate and thereby mitigate the effects we're having on the environment, that's a way that our species would be adapting.
Absolutely. And it's what we've been doing for as long as there have been humans on the planet. Right?
That's interesting. So Nicole, do you want to weigh in on this?
Sure. Well, I might go back to a question that Ingrid also asked, which is what is environmental behavior, which I think is a great question as well, also huge. And this might bring us back to the broader group of people who were at the conference, both those who presented as well as those who attended, and also to our group here in the Doors School, which is that, often we think about what is environmental behavior. It's not only in this sense of thinking about adaptation, but also thinking more broadly about people from the decision sciences, people from psychology, sociology, political science, geography, anthropology, a broad range of social sciences, people who are interested in how people imagine themselves as taking action related to the environment and sustainability more broadly. And so when we thought about who to invite to the conference in terms of speakers, we really did try to imagine a broad set of people representing a range of disciplines and interdisciplinary perspectives. And so that's also represented in the faculty members who are in our group. We also saw that across the talks that we had, which I found really interesting and engaging. It was like mental gymnastics as we went from talk to talk. We not only had a lot of disciplinary perspectives, but also people applying those in a variety of contexts, everything from climate change to water scarcity, even talking about different labeling schemes. So it was a really interesting combination of the way that people talked about these different topics.
Don't forget entomophagy.
Oh my gosh, that's right. Really, my notes are all over the place.
Yeah, explain that one.
Entomophagy is what, if it was not in humans, we'd call it insectivory, right? It's eating insects, and it's arguably a much more, well, not arguably, I mean, it is clearly a more energy friendly means of acquiring animal protein if we just could suck it up and eat insects. And Christina Moya talked about the cultural barriers to entomophagy, that people think insects are yucky and often don't want to eat them. But there is actually a great deal of entomophagy that happens in the comparative ethnographic context. Lots of different groups of people across space and through time have eaten insects, and they've done very well with them. There are lots of really tasty insects. And so how we could change to a more sustainable method of acquiring animal protein through farming insects, is a question of behavior change and culture and environmental behavior.
And so for that example, Christina talked about this behavior that relates to the environment, the eating of insects. And then we broke that down in terms of, or that is an adaptation that might become more common with climate change and needing to rely on more energy efficient food supplies. And so there were more examples also at the conference, such as informal water markets, and how informal water markets and decisions about where to source your water, like that's an environmental behavior. And we're seeing adaptations as the climate shifts and those water markets are also changing.
Building on both these examples we've just discussed, as well as a number of other examples that came up at the conference, much of the discussion was around the idea of both individual actions as well as collective actions. And almost all of the speakers emphasize this need to think about these kind of collective action behaviors and societal shifts, which I found to be a very interesting topic of discussion that also continued during our breaks and during lunch. This discussion of how our societies are shifting norms, and Jamie's example of eating insects is a really interesting thought exercise of how do our norms shift not only among individuals or even smaller populations or smaller parts of the culture, but also as we think about this in these larger, more collective terms. And almost all of our speakers touched on that in some way.
Adapting to climate change and mitigating the worst effects of climate change is the grandest collective action problem that our species has ever faced. And I think that, focusing on how people go about solving collective action problems at scale and at different scales, right? Because, the thing about climate change and sustainability is that we have to think about these at different scales. I think that there's often a tendency, particularly whenever the anthropologists talk, there are a bunch of grumpy people in the room and they're like, well, but what does this have to do with global and scaling, right? And the reality is that, so for example, Bill, in Manila, right, when floods happen and people have to respond to the floods, it's a local response. like, yeah, we would like to stop the ocean rising, maybe do some mitigation to reduce the effects. But when people are adapting to the flooding, they're doing so at a local spatial scale, right? So we need to think about how people respond and how we organize collective responses at all these different spatial scales. And I think that was a nice thing about our group, is that we had people who were definitely thinking at different spatial scales and scales of social organization.
That's interesting. So when we're listening to the two of you saying collective action, I know many of the listeners are probably thinking at a very grand scale of the entire world, maybe, or nation states, but you're really thinking at different levels of analysis, organizations, groups, communities.
Absolutely. You have to organize collective action to raise children. You might know something about that, right?
Yeah,
you have to organize a household in order to or beyond an extended household to raise your children, right? And we have global problems as well that we need to engage in massive collective action in order to try to address.
Interesting.
And education came into that conversation regarding collective action. Do you mind expanding how that relates?
Yeah, we had a couple of speakers who spoke about the role of education, not only thinking about young people, which of course is where our mind often goes, but thinking about the entire system. So as Bill was just mentioning, how do we think about the role of institutions in this? And education is one of our most powerful institutions in terms of social change. And so one of our speakers, Noah Feinstein from the University of Wisconsin, asked us to imagine how we could think about societal change through incorporating and working in collaboration with the educational system, really emphasizing the role that families and youth have in terms of imagining a better future world around climate change when we engage a transformed educational system. We also heard from Kai Chan from the University of British Columbia, who was also challenging us to think about transforming institutions. So I think, to Bill's point, when we think about collective action, it's not only this individual and community scale change, but also really thinking about transforming institutions.
And when we talked about transforming institutions at the conference, just to break that down a little bit more, we discussed both literally transforming them in terms of hardware and how equipped they are for dealing with future environmental crises, but also more in sort of a soft sense, like how can we use these institutions to bring people together to communicate and create ideas and help solve these problems, to kind of bridge those barriers between communities and help for collective action to occur.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, there's a truism from evolutionary biology, widely misunderstood, but you can sort of simplify it to say that it's called Fisher's fundamental theorem of natural selection. And it basically says that the rate of change, which you can think of as being the rate of adaptation of a population, is equal to the variance in fitness. So the variance in, all the solutions to the problems that are out there. And so if we want to adapt to a rapidly changing environment, we need to pump variation into the system. We need diversity. And that's really what innovation is, right? Innovation is about diversity of solutions and then finding the things that are the best functional fit to the problem at hand, and providing incentives and institutions that promote the things that actually work better than, for example, the status quo, right?
This is remarkable hearing you guys talk about this, that I know a lot of our listeners probably, when they saw innovation in the title of this podcast, were thinking of technological innovation, a new widget. And that is a form of innovation, but sure, that's not at all what we're talking about here.
No, we're thinking about changing social structure. We're thinking about changing norms. We're thinking about changing the behavior of individuals and collectives of individuals. These are the kind of innovations that we desperately need to address our sustainability challenges, but it's also, the sort of core material for an environmental behavioral sciences department.
At the risk of sounding too academic, I will say, another place that where the group went in the conversations was the need to transform from a theoretical perspective. So a number of our speakers called for this need to have some more unified theories or some better understandings of how we think about human behavior. And so a couple of our speakers really called out the fact that a lot of our human behavior theories are based on a world of the past. So for example, Paul Smaldino from UC Merced, spoke about the fact that much of our understanding is based on human behavior in an older world, in a world that was not as transformed by climate change, that was not changing as quickly as the world of today. And so thinking about how do we understand human behavior, social norms, transforming institutions in today's very quickly shifting world. And a number of our speakers spoke about this need to really shift our understanding of theory so that we can also better understand the world of practice.
One of those speakers who talked about the need for theory was me. And this is something that I think is super important as we lay out the vision for a new school. I mean, not only do we have a new school, but we have a department that I think, I mean, maybe I'm exaggerating, but it seems pretty unique to me. And we have a real opportunity to build something new and innovative and transformative here. And whenever social scientists get pulled into problems, right? Problems in the world, sustainability, adaptation to climate change, that sort of thing, there's always a great deal of pressure for them to apply the knowledge immediately. And I worry about that in a new school and a new department of environmental behavioral sciences, because the world that we are trying to create is a world that doesn't exist yet. And we have to be able to make statements about something that we cannot make empirical observations of yet. That means we need theory. Theory is the thing that allows us to make statements about phenomena that we haven't observed. And so theory, Kurt Lewin, the Austrian psychologist, said that there's nothing more practical than a good theory, right? And it's for exactly that reason. Theory allows you to make statements and make predictions and develop scientific research programs that have strong applied foci about things that you haven't observed yet.
Can you give an example?
The moral economies that Melissa Beresford talked about with like economic practices, shared ethos of justice, and social pressure, and sort of the toggling between all of those. Like there's interconnecting arrows every which way, and so as those toggle in different directions, you can adjust like the social outcome or like the outcome that you see in the economy. And so if we're hoping to adapt for climate change, we need to understand how those things are interrelated and how to toggle certain things to get different results.
No, that's right. I mean, Melissa presented a very sophisticated theory that's actually an old debate in anthropology. The debates around moral economies goes back to the 1960s. And it's kind of been forgotten, and Melissa's doing a fantastic job of resurrecting the sort of good parts of that and thinking about how we can project that into the future. And so you have to have a model for how people respond to different regimes of water availability, and you may not have observed the one that they're going to have in the near future. If you have, say, you have a curve of what demand is or what the price that people are willing to pay, or at what point do people move away, right? You can predict when that's going to happen, even if you haven't observed it yet.
That's interesting. That's, it reminds me, there's a view in organization design that when you're trying to create innovation, you have to think that your job is not to know, but it's to design the systems that discover. And those systems will produce failures, they'll produce variability, they'll produce foolishness, but along the way we get some solution.
But you need the variability. That's what selection works on. And another theme that came out of my talk, and it was implicit in a couple other people's talks, and Pizer from Washington State and Paul Smaldino talked about this as well, is failing often and early. If you're going to fail, you should do it quickly, right? And then move on to the next thing. And so thinking about how we develop social institutions that allow people to try things out, to inject this variability into the systems, and then when they don't work, to drop them, right? That's a really important social innovation that we need to develop. An example of that might be something like basic income. I think of basic income as being insurance for the downside of innovation.
Especially in an era of climate-induced migration, which we know to be good in the long run for economic development and for the abatement of human misery, but that requires there be some basic income. So maybe any last things you want to say before we close off the podcast about this terrific conference that you guys just ran? And Nicole, why don't you kick this off?
So another interesting example relating theory into practice or theory into research was when Paul was talking about the theory of covert signaling, which he talked about in his work, and then that also showed up in a couple of the other talks. So I don't, there's other examples of that.
Yeah, I mean, Pete Richardson, sort of the grand old man of cultural evolution theory, was there, and he was amazing. And he injected some theory, which honestly was a little bit sobering, that he and his former student Charles Efferson have been developing, talking about humans basically as super predators that our sociality, or what's sometimes called by like people like Peter Turchin, our ultra sociality, allows us to basically become super resource extractors, and that they had a system of dynamical equations, and then they showed that they, under essentially all circumstances, they run away and they do bad things, and that was pretty sobering. He likened human extractive capacities to an unstable fighter craft like an F-15. With a Cessna, if you let go of the stick, it'll keep flying itself. With an F-15, it'll go into a tailspin. And so you have to actively, and you typically need a computer to do that, to keep an F-15 flying. He likened human extractive capacities to that. One other talk that I thought was really great that I think is missing from our broad sustainability conversations was Leslie Root's talk on demography and fertility. And there's so many crazy ideas right now about fertility. And Leslie was just so clear-eyed and had such a long-term perspective on population and a critical perspective on all the sort of hysteria around declining birth rates right now. I thought that was really terrific.
Overall, it was a really invigorating 2 days. Just such an interesting arc in terms of starting with Pete from some of this really interesting and sobering theory, and then ending up with some really practical and applied lessons for all of us to take away from the conference. There also were some elements that were very came out in the I would say the emotional side. So I found that it was very interesting. Melissa was talking about these notions around shame and upset in terms of the water market and water sharing, which was not an aspect of the water market that I had reflected on earlier.
Mm-hmm.
So I think coming out of the conference, it was this very interesting productive tension between talks that were focusing very heavily on the theory building and theory generating side, and then those that were really focused on doing deep community engaged work. Certainly the conversations that I heard throughout the conference suggested there would be partnerships that would be coming from this, a lot of ongoing conversations. So I felt like coming out of it, there were ideas that generated for me that I hadn't touched on before. So I really, really appreciated the ongoing discussions.
Excellent. Well, James, Nicole, Ingrid, thanks so much for all your good work. And from all of us here at Stanford, to you listeners, until next time. The Stanford Initiative on Business and Environmental Sustainability podcast series is sponsored by the Stanford Graduate School of Business and the Stanford Dorr School of Sustainability. Music by Charged Particles. That's Caleb Hutzler, Mike Rock, and John Krosnick.